The Rogue is a hybrid class for those indecisive Diablo players who can't decide between melee or ranged or a little bit of both, plus some stealth options, maybe some traps. But here is my class guide for the Rogue in Diablo 4. Let's go! Let me know in the comments if you are playing as a rogue and what your build is. And these class guides are designed to get you familiar with a particular class, give you a bit of a leveling build, and give you a general overview of everything you need to know about that class. So we'll start with that overview. Now, the main resource for the rogue is energy, which regenerates over time and can be gathered by its basic skills. You spend that resource via all of your other skills, and the rogue here is a very hybrid class. They can use ranged with a bow or a crossbow, or melee combat with daggers and a sword. This isn't all the rogue has though. You've got status effects that you can apply like poison, cold, or shadow, or use traps to trap enemies and CC them. Plus you've got movement abilities so you can manipulate the battlefield and sort of move around more freely than some of the other classes. Wrapping all this package together, the Rogue is a very versatile class, often leaning into critical damage with the vulnerability status, plus lots of status effects and different ways you can manipulate the enemies in the battlefield with things like CC or crowd control. But the weaknesses here is that the class can be pretty weak sometimes or squishy because of the low amount of overall HP and having to sort of blend between the long range and the close range abilities. And also because of that, it can be difficult sometimes in terms of playing this class, not only because of positioning and because of how the movement abilities can affect that, but also in terms of the build variety, because there's a lot of different things that you can do. And, you know, should you lean into melee or ranged or traps, etc., there's a lot of flexibility, which can make it one of the harder classes to play. Attributes are one of the most important things in any of the classes, and for a rogue, dexterity should be your primary attribute. This increases your overall skill damage as well as your dodge chance, which is important for the squishy elements for this class. And secondary is probably somewhere between intelligence and strength. So intelligence increases your critical strike chance and your resistances to all elements, whereas strength increases your resource generation, so energy, and increases your armor. But dexterity is definitely your primary, and then intelligence or strength, sort of look for that secondarily on most of your gear. But always look at the gear and see what stats it's actually giving you, as a piece of gear may not actually be better for you just because that armor value is higher. You may actually lose some attack power or health just because it doesn't have the right secondary stats. So the leveling build that we're going to go through here is a melee focused build leaning into flurry as the primary like burst damage dealing attack, as well as some decent resistances because of a particular passive called siphoning strikes, which give you health back when you critical hit, which does happen very often as this class. The basic skill for this build is Invigorating Strike, which is just your general sort of melee attack that will generate you energy, and we want to enhance this and then go into fundamental Invigorating Strikes. When you're below 50% energy, you will apply the vulnerable status to enemies, which you can drop with Flurry, which is our primary attack, so you can get that below 50, then get that vulnerable status, and then by leveling up Flurry, going enhanced and improved Flurry, so if Flurry hits a vulnerable enemy, it will make all enemies hit by that cast vulnerable as well. So by getting a vulnerability trigger, Flurry will then spread that to all of the enemies, increasing the overall damage that they will take. Now, both Invigorating Strike and Flurry you want to max out, as these are your primary sort of basic attacks. And then even in just that secondary line, you want to grab Sturdy to increase your close range damage reduction, and Siphoning Strikes to give you some health back when you critically strike enemies that are close by. Moving on to the next tree, we're going to pick up Dash here, and then Enhanced Dash and Discipline Dash, though it doesn't really matter too much. Dash is mostly just used to help you get around in combat. You could drop this for Shadow Strike if you prefer that ability, but in this line, pick up Weapon Mastery to increase your overall damage with daggers or swords, whichever you have equipped at that time, though either is really fine. Down in the next tree, you want to grab Exploit to increase your damage to healthy and injured enemies, as well as Malice to increase your damage to vulnerable enemies even more. Moving on to the next tree, you want to pick up Shadow Imbuement and max this out, obviously enhance it, and then we're going to go Blended Shadow Imbue here. So Shadow Imbuement's primary explosion makes enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds, just another way that you can trigger that vulnerability status. And then grab Shadow Crash to increase your shadow damage, and Consuming Shadows, so each time you kill an enemy with shadow damage, you generate energy to increase your energy so you can dump more flurries into that different attack. Now, Precision Imbuement is also good to grab here to increase your critical strike chance for imbued skills. And then into the next tree, which is your ultimate. I am a fan of Shadow Clone just because I like to clone myself. It deals okay damage, plus when you're triggering all of these like status effects, you can get tons of flurries off with your clone, you'll deal a heap of burst damage to enemies, especially once you've picked up Supreme Shadow Clone to increase that 20% damage of your clone. The last skill that I used primarily while leveling my rogue was Smoke Grenade to trigger the dazed effect on enemies, and if an enemy is vulnerable, which they probably will be because of your other effects, they'll daze for longer, so it'll stop them from attacking you, which is pretty valuable, especially playing solo, and you can trigger this status effect pretty easy with the Smoke Grenade. Now into the very end of the line, you've got 5 different options here, and I went with Momentum. So Cutthroat skills grant a stack of Momentum, which will increase your damage reduction, your energy regen, and movement speed. This is really good for solo because of that damage reduction plus energy generation. Movement speed's always valuable here, but if you aren't struggling with survivability, close quarters combat or Victimize is probably the better ones here. So they're probably the 2 more damage focused, but for me playing solo, I was originally running Victimize and then I ended up switching to Momentum for the damage reduction to help a little bit there. But once you've got these skills and you start leveling them up, the further you get, you want to pick up more passives and spend more points into the passives that we've already talked about here. You could also grab something like Agile to increase your dodge chance, or Stutter Step to increase your movement speed when you critically strike, but mostly focus on the actual abilities first, plus those couple of initial passives, and then start expanding your passives the further you get down the line once you've maxed out the main skills that we're using in this build. For your gems, while you're leveling, gems aren't super critical, but if you've got them, you may as well put them into your slots. For weapon, Topaz here is definitely best to increase your basic skill damage, though emeralds are pretty good for the critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies, which enemies are always going to be vulnerable. For armor, emerald here for thorns, which will deal damage to enemies when they hit you, and ruby's not too bad to increase maximum life. In your jewelry, skull probably for the extra armor, though maybe diamonds to increase the resistance to all elements, but it doesn't matter too much for rubies. The class specialization for the rogue unlocks at level 15. Now you have to do a side quest in order to unlock this. So as soon as you hit level 15 and you see that side quest pop up, go and do this quest. Now there are 3 different class specializations, the first being combo points. Combo points are generated by your basic attacks and then they're consumed by your other skills, and they deal additional effects depending on the amount of combo points you do have. Inner Sight unlocks at level 20, which will mark enemies, and attacking marked enemies will fill the Inner Sight gauge, and once it's full, you'll have unlimited energy for 4 seconds. And Preparation, which unlocks at level 30, every 100 energy you spend reduces your ultimate skill cooldown by 4 seconds, and using an ult will reset your cooldowns of your other abilities. Combo points is the one that we want to go here, specifically because of how it increases your overall damage, and it's the most flexible here. So this leads us really directly into our last couple of tips. Now you want to pay attention to those combo points. So 3 invigorating strikes will generate 3 points, and then you can dump those points with Flurry to increase the overall damage of the Flurry. And Flurry is your main damage dealing ability, and it's the way that you're going to dump that energy, especially to get you below 50% if you need to trigger a vulnerability with invigorating strikes, and then even outside of that, just to spread that vulnerability to other enemies. The Codex of Power is really critical to look at the different legendary aspects to be able to see where they are found in dungeons. The only one that I would recommend investing in while you're leveling is the aspect of Encircling Blades. Now you can get this easily in the Fractured Peaks. You can see which dungeon this is actually located in, and this will increase the damage of your Flurry as well as make it attack all around you rather than just in front. I've used this through my entire leveling playthrough, and it makes such a difference to your overall damage output, as well as meaning that you don't necessarily have to aim as much because your main damage dealing ability will just hit anything around you, which happens a lot during combat. When you're sort of in the thick of things, you'll definitely get surrounded. It really makes that process a lot easier. But let me know any rogue tips you have in the comments down below. Thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.